Good morning or good evening, whatever your time zone is. My name is Krista Karvinen, and I am from the University of Leeds, where my research is foreign volunteers in Finland during World War II. But today's presentation is about East-Karelia and the Finnish role in its military governance in 1941 to 1944. And the title is Conquering Liberators, because the Finnish army was both. Firstly, it is important to understand the concept of the Greater Finland. On the map, you have seen different colors of different ethnic groups and geographical areas, which were at some point or another considered part of the Greater Finland. And this idea was championed by an organization called the Academic Karelia Society. And despite its name, it was involved in areas outside of Karelia as well. And this organization, it was not a fascist group, but it was more of a nationalistic group in its sense, and it did promote like this idea of supremacy of Finnish culture. And while it was not in power per se, it did have many notable members of Finnish establishment involved in it: professors, lawyers, officers, politicians, captains of industry, and so on. And East Karelia especially was considered the most easiest place, or the most prominent place to expand or start with the Greater Finland idea. A quick recap, if you are unaware of what happened in Finland during World War II, was that Soviet put pressure on the Baltic states and Finland, and eventually this led to the Winter War, in which for 105 days Finland resisted the Red Army, but had to accept a truce eventually before complete collapse of the front. And Finland lost Western Karelia and about 10% of its territory to the Soviet Union, but remained independent. After the war, the situation was very precarious, and Finland aligned itself with Nazi Germany, as it was seen that Germany is the only salvation against the growing threat from Soviet Union. And this led to German troops being sent to Lapland, and in fact, half of Finland, the northern half of Finland, was under German command or control at that time for their attack towards Murmansk. And then in June 1941, at the end of the month, Finland joined the German Operation Barbarossa with the idea of getting back what had been lost in the Winter War with interest. And on this map, you can see on red the areas that the Finnish army captured, and you can see the old border there marked in the middle of the red area. And continuation war can be divided into attack phase, static phase, and the Soviet strategic strike, in which Finnish army was pushed back to the borders of the Winter War, and this eventually led to peace. Finland remained independent, but did lose quite a bit of land. Mostly this presentation is involved with the static phase, because that is where the military administration of East Karelia was mostly active. When Finnish troops came to East Karelia, the Finnish army propaganda units made out of peacetime journalists and advertising men and so on made a big deal about how the Russians burned everything down and how the area was devastated. And similarly, to push this idea of Finns coming as liberators, here is a propaganda picture of an army chaplain giving a sermon to Ingrian refugees who are crying from joy because they are hearing the word of God for the first time in 20 years. And this sort of image was presented to the home front of smiling civilians happy to be cooking for the refugees and for the Finnish army. And in addition to this liberating of the civilians, there was this idea of reclaiming areas. So in this picture, you have a former chief of police, then a commandant of this town, and a local cultural champion, both lieutenants in the Finnish army, who are now reclaiming Karelia back. And it is important to note that in the original caption, the Finnish photographer used the word cleaning up the town of Sortavala. And in a similar way, here is a Swedish journalist interviewing Karelian family in the town of Äänislinna. Äänislinna's Russian name is Petropavlovsk, and Äänislinna was never part of Finland back in the day. And Äänislinna, or Petropavlovsk, became the capital of East Karelia during the Finnish occupation. And this shows the local population left behind when the Red Army retreated. So it was mostly women and small children, and then some old men. But the men of fighting age had all most of them been drafted into the Red Army. And so this population then eventually became a major problem for the Finnish authorities. And one way to deal with the population was to bring in Finnish settlers. And this is Karelian refugees. So during the Winter War, the vast majority, nearly all of Karelians were evacuated into Finland. And then during the Continuation War, as things calmed down, these refugees returned back to their homelands, but some of them were rerouted by the authorities into East Karelia in order to broaden the base of Finnish ethnicities or ethnicities related to Finns as a counterweight to the Russian population. And there is another similar picture, bringing cattle and horses back to Karelia, taking a break. So the Finnish military administration in East Karelia was formed in July 1941. And first it was stationed in Mikkeli and later at Joensuu. And only in 1943 was the headquarters of the administration actually placed in East Karelia in Äänislinna. So most of its existence it stayed in proper in eastern Finland. It was staffed by several AKS members, and AKS ideology was very strong in the administration, but it was not run by academic Karelia society. Its mission was twofold. Importantly, was to create economic ties to fatherland, so that East Karelia would not be a drain on Finland, but instead it would be self-sufficient and eventually a lumber mill of Finland, an economic powerhouse that could be help in the development of the entire country. Equally important was its civilizing mission to convert the Orthodox to Lutherans and stamp out Russian language and replace it with Finnish language and so on and so forth. And in this mission, it had the support of the Finnish Church, Lutheran Church, as well as the Finnish state in the form of school teachers being sent to East Karelia to create schools for the local children. And the administration was divided in 3 regions with 18 districts all in all. And as mentioned, the population was a problem because it turns out the local population were not warmly embracing Finnish soldiers, and they were not long lost ethnic or of cultural brothers or linguistic brothers of Finns. Before the war, it had already been, due to Stalin's purges, the population was majority Russians. And in 1941, due to war and evacuations, the population has dropped to little under 90,000. And this was then divided by the Finnish military authorities into the nationals group, which included all groups, Finno-Uralic ethnic and language groups that could be related to Finns, and then the foreigner groups, which was basically Russians, Ukrainians, and so on. And you can see from the numbers that the foreigners outnumber the nationals. And so this was a problem both security-wise and also for the cultural mission of the military administration. So the first solution was internship. So the administration created 2 concentration camps. In addition, there were smaller temporal camps, and then prisoner of war camps were an entirely different matter. But roughly half of the foreign group was deemed to be a security risk, or they were living too close to front lines, so they had to be moved. And they were put on these 2 concentration camps in East Karelia. And here you can see more German officers with Finnish officers touring one of these camps in 1942. On the background, the second from the left, you can actually see the Japanese military attaché to Finland, who is also taking a tour here. So these camps should be seen more along the lines of like the American internment camps for Japanese Americans, rather than the death camps of Germany. And while disease and malnutrition caused the deaths of estimated 4,600 people, the purpose of the camps was not to wipe out the civilian population. In fact, when rumors of concentration camps of what was happening in Germany started spreading into Finland, the authorities changed the name of the camps from concentration to transfer camps. One part was also of the culturizing and civilizing mission was bringing Finnish culture to Karelia. And this was the frankly funny idea that the Finnish culture was slumbering or sleeping inside the Karelians, and you just needed to wake it up to make it blossom because it had been suffering under Bolshevism. And this is a theatre troupe from city of Tampere in central Finland performing for the Karelians. The military administration to acquire the hearts and minds uh, created a civilian healthcare system as well. And while the national group received same level of healthcare as Finns in Finland, the foreign group did not, and it was actually completely segregated. Everything in East Karelia was segregated between the national groups on one hand and then the foreign group on the other hand. The only exception being tobacco, which surprisingly was equal. So we can guess that the food rations, job opportunities, and healthcare for the foreigner group was much worse than what was available for the national group. And here is a classic propaganda about Maria girl hit by shrapnel, now healing so well under the care of Finnish doctors that she is helping out the nurses at the hospital. And the final aspect, of course, was to remind everybody that this area is now part of Finland, now and forever. And so here, soldiers are celebrating the first anniversary of occupation of East Karelia, raising the flag at the island of Konevitsa. Another aspect of the military administration was, of course, the recruitment of so-called tribal warriors. So these were men of various ethnic groups, as talked before, who would serve in Finland. And these men, as in this caption, the old man Kalle Tuhkanen was only 14 years old when he joined the Finnish army in 1918 for the first time. Now he is waging his third war, accompanied by new comrades. Do note the helmets, which are quite weird looking and not standard Finnish helmets. I think these are captured Russian helmets. In any case, Finns had a long history of recruiting volunteers from the various tribal groups, which we can see here on the map, the major groups which were considered tribal Finns, or at least related to Finns, so different Finno-Uralic groups. And the major units are listed there. The difference between some of them are like Brigade K had Karelians and Ingrias who had been living in Finland since 1918 or who had come to Finland during the kinship wars or the tribal wars of the 1920s. And so they spoke fluent Finnish and had been living in Finland for over a decade, if not two. Independent Battalion 6 was Ingrians, who were in 1943 moved from Germany or German-occupied Russia into Finland, alongside thousands of Ingrian civilians. And in exchange, Finland handed over Russian and Ukrainian prisoners of war. Tribal Battalion 3 was recruited from the prisoner of war camps. So Karelians, Ingrians, Vepsians, and other Finnish speakers, or men who didn't even speak Finnish but could trace a Finnish parent or a Finnish grandparent, were recruited from the prisoner of war camps. In addition, small groups were working in garrison and supply units, and then individuals working as translators and interrogators. And the main enemy for during this time, of course, was the Russian desadniks, the agents, and infiltrators, and the partisans. So, unlike elsewhere, the partisans in East Karelia were generally not local population taking up arms or stragglers left behind by the Red Army. Now, these were trained and equipped at NKVD training site and then dropped by parachute, or they were crossing the border in small groups, or crossing the front lines in small groups, and to perform attacks against both civilian and military targets. In this propaganda picture, dog has found tracks, and the patrol is chasing Russian infiltrators. Here is one picture of an infiltrator. This Ingrian man spoke fluent Finnish and was wearing a Finnish Frontier Guard uniform, which meant that he was most likely executed soon after taking this picture. Here are two more agents to show the variety that the Russians used. So here is ethnic Russian Sergei Ivanovich from Leningrad, a high school graduate. And on the right-hand side is a Russian Jew. Unfortunately, we don't know anything more about him. He was captured near Hanko, which is nowhere near East Karelia. But it shows that the agents were placed or dropped all over Finland. But of course, East Karelia was a hotbed of activity. Here is an Ingrian named Laukkanen, and that is a very traditional Finnish name, and showing off his radio. It is possible that he switched sides and became a double agent for the Finns, which would have ensured his survival. Because, as said, agents in civilian clothes or Finnish uniform, whether they were partisans or desantnik, would be generally executed after a quick trial on the field. Though some of these trials did go to higher court levels, and sometimes executions were turned into imprisonments, and sometimes imprisonments were turned into executions. At least 785 were executed, killed in action, or sentenced to life in prison. And this execution took place at the very front near Rukajärvi, which was the farthest edge east that the Finnish army was controlling. Here we see an Estonian agent with a very traditional Russian name showing off his equipment, photographed by Finnish journalists. Red Army infiltrators committed 45 attacks upon civilians, causing 181 deaths, which was a very sore point for the Finns. Many efforts were done to try to stop the partisans from attacking, but this was a very difficult struggle as there was in the northern Karelia and then further north, there was no definite front line. Instead, what you had was outposts and small bases in the deep forest and swamps. Yes, operational leadership by General Versinin and training and organization led by Komsomol leader Andropov, who of course became a very famous figure in Soviet Union post-war. And here is a final example of a partisan captured near Rukajärvi while trying to cross the front line. As said, if you switch sides, you could avoid the death penalty, though not always. Curious fact was that some partisans turned out to be common criminals recruited from prisons and promised freedom if they survived their mission into Finland. And these men often turned against each other or immediately surrendered when they got into Finland. So, in conclusions, the military administration was a failure on the grand scheme of things, as East-Karelia was constantly a drain on Finnish resources. The civilizing mission was a limited success. The Karelians enjoyed the schools because education was a privilege in a very poor area. But most of them were very happy to continue speaking Russian or following Orthodox religion. And they were certainly not awoken into being true Finns in any way, as the AKS had imagined before the war. Counterinsurgency operations were mostly successful, so the internment plan did work because the villages were now majority populated by Karelians or Ingrians and so on. And so any infiltrators or partisans trying to hide among the civilian population were usually brought to the attention of the Finnish soldiers very quickly, sometimes in just few hours. However, this did not come for free. There was a high cost, which was the death rate among interned civilians. Malnutrition was widespread in entire Finland. At points, Finland was suffering from starvation. But it's also true that the foreign group received the smallest and the poorest rations. Only prisoners of war were fed worse. And you can see the actual death percentages there. So this led to the situation of the evaporation of the fantasy of Greater Finland. And this idea has never been part of mainstream discussion after the war. Because clearly, it was even during the war, even before Finland lost the war, it was clear that East Karelia was not going to be some sort of a happy paradise, a Garden of Eden for Finnish liberators. And it is important to point out that tribal warriors were used on both sides. So both the Finnish army and the Red Army recruited from all groups, population groups, and used soldiers both as in partisan or infiltration attacks, as well as regular warfare. Thank you for your attention.